They thought firing me on a Friday evening would erase me. 5 minutes in HR, a signed form, and I was out the door. What Ethan, the CEO, didn't know was that the payroll system, the one feeding 3,000 families every Monday, still carried my credentials like its heartbeat. On Monday, that heartbeat would stop. Blank pay stubs, frozen accounts, and panic weren't revenge. They were inevitability. I built the system they depended on, and without me, it would devour itself. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you rethink every boss who ever called you replaceable. Subscribe, and tell me your worst firing story in the comments. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Ethan Cross, the CEO, leaned back in his chair while Marta from HR slid a packet toward me like she was handing over a receipt. Your role has run its course, Teresa. Technology moves fast, and we need fresh energy. He delivered the line with the confidence of a man who believed his own script. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I signed the form, handed over my badge, and stood up without so much as a goodbye. Ethan smirked as if firing me was the clean stroke of leadership he could brag about at dinner parties. What he didn't know was that my badge wasn't the key. The real key, the slim silver card to the server room, was still in my purse. The same card I had used for years to maintain the payroll system he thought would run on autopilot. I left with a cardboard box, 2 certificates, and a stress ball shaped like a globe. To anyone watching, it looked like a quiet exit. But inside that silence lived a truth he would discover on Monday morning. Payroll didn't run without me. He thought he'd erased a line item. What he really did was erase his company's lifeline. For a decade, I was nothing more than Teresa from IT, the quiet woman in the corner who fixed logins, patched updates, and made sure the printers didn't jam during board meetings. They saw a support role, not an architect. But the truth was every paycheck, every tax filing, every health insurance premium in this company passed through code I wrote line by line. I was the one who linked the payroll batches to state reporting systems, who mapped the deductions to IRS tables, who embedded the credential chain so a single misstep triggered an authorization stop. To them, it was invisible. To me, it was architecture. A spiderweb so tightly woven that removing one strand would unravel the whole thing. Ethan, the CEO, never understood this. Neither did Graham, the CFO, who once joked in front of the board that an intern could run payroll. I smiled that day because I knew he hadn't opened a terminal in his life. He had no idea how many emergency patches I'd written at midnight to stop compliance errors from triggering audits. He never saw the months I spent building continuity scripts so the system could catch its own mistakes before the Department of Labor noticed. He didn't even realize my initials were embedded in the scheduler string, not as vanity, but as a failsafe. Remove me, and the chain snapped. They thought payroll was just numbers moving across a screen. I knew it was arteries carrying oxygen through the body. Cut the artery, and the body doesn't limp. It seizes. Over the years, I caught every corner they cut. Executives wanted faster onboarding. I hard-coded approval delays into the system to force verification. HR tried to push incomplete tax forms. I buried blocks that rejected them. They mocked me for clinging to checklists, but those checklists kept them from federal fines. I built guardrails around their recklessness, and in the process, I became the only one who knew where the cliff edges were. The irony was rich. The very thing they considered replaceable was the reason they'd survived this long without headlines, lawsuits, or unpaid employees marching in protest. They paraded their growth charts, their glossy annual reports, their photos with politicians at chamber dinners. Behind it all, I sat in the server room, headphones on, carrying the actual load. It wasn't glamorous, and I never asked for recognition, but I did expect respect, the bare minimum acknowledgement that without the system I built, their house of glass wouldn't stand a week. Instead, I got a smirk and a cardboard box. That was fine, because when I walked out on Friday, I didn't have to plot a single move. The trap was already set. They just hadn't realized I'd been holding the blueprint all along. Monday would be the first time in 10 years that payroll tried to run without me. And that silence, no batches processed, no stubs printed, would speak louder than any words I could ever deliver. At 7 a.m. sharp, the payroll system tried to start its cycle, the same way it had for the past 10 years. I wasn't there to watch the progress bar inch across the screen, but I didn't have to be. I knew what would happen. At 7:01, the system reached for my credentials, the digital fingerprint embedded into every authorization chain, and came back empty. At 7:02, 3,000 employees across 5 states opened their accounts expecting paychecks and instead saw blank stubs. Some thought it was a glitch. Some thought the deposit was just delayed. By 7:10, managers refreshing their dashboards saw red messages. Authorization failed, missing credentials. The CFO's phone lit up like a slot machine, buzzing with back-to-back calls from frantic department heads. Ethan, the CEO, was probably still in his gym clothes, oblivious that his empire had just cracked open before breakfast. I was parked across the street in my car, sipping coffee, watching people shuffle into the glass office tower, balancing lattes and laptop bags. At first, it looked like every other Monday. Then the rhythm broke. I spotted Graham, the CFO, storming through the lobby, his tie askew, his phone glued to his ear. Behind him, a junior HR manager stumbled, clutching a stack of papers like a lifeline. Security buzzed more than usual as employees complained their pay hadn't hit. By 7:30, whispers turned to panic. Slack channels lit up. Did payroll process? My bank says nothing posted. Anyone else getting blank stubs? Someone dropped a meme of a dumpster fire. It wasn't funny for long. Within an hour, the failure had traveled across every department. Customer service reps fielded calls from employees asking if they'd been laid off. Regional managers scrambled to reassure field staff. Contractors threatened to walk off sites if payments didn't clear. In one office, I knew, someone would be standing over Jenna from accounts payable, demanding answers she couldn't possibly give. She was new, promoted too quickly, tossed into a role she barely understood. And now, because I was gone, she was staring at error codes no one had ever trained her to read. Inside the executive suite, Graham must have been swearing under his breath, trying to reach the vendor hotline, unaware that vendors weren't the problem. The problem was sitting in her car. Me, listening to local radio and waiting for the world to catch up. At 8 o'clock, the IT team logged into the payroll servers and tried to rerun the cycle. Same error, authorization failed. They checked system time, memory allocation, database connections. All green. Then they dug deeper and saw it. The credential string, the unique token tied to my identity, was missing. Not deleted, not broken, just absent, like a missing tooth. The system was functioning exactly as designed. It refused to process payroll without me. At 8:30, the first all-hands meeting was called. Ethan walked in, confident as ever, brushing off concerns with talk of minor delays. He blamed legacy software. He promised it would be fixed by lunch. I almost laughed out loud in my car because I knew the truth. It wasn't legacy. It was me. Every check, every deduction, every tax submission, they all needed my digital key. By 9 o'clock, the line outside HR stretched down the hall. People wanted answers, or at least assurances that their mortgages wouldn't bounce. Graham's phone was still buzzing. Ethan was still pretending it was nothing. But the cracks had already spread. Payroll wasn't just money, it was trust. And once trust breaks, you don't tape it back together with a speech. You watch it shatter in real time. The first wave of panic was employees staring at empty accounts. But the second wave hit harder because money doesn't stop at paychecks. By late morning, vendors began flagging non-payment. The hotel chain that housed regional sales teams sent a blunt notice: payment overdue. Services suspended until cleared. Health insurance premiums, normally auto-debited on payroll day, bounced back, flagged as insufficient. Within hours, the bank that handled the company's primary line of credit issued an automatic freeze pending system discrepancies. Ethan still tried to hold his posture, pacing the executive suite with his jacket off, telling anyone who would listen that it was a glitch, a delay, a minor hiccup. But the dominoes were already falling. At noon, employees flooded HR with calls about missed rent and childcare payments. By 2 o'clock, contractors in 3 states refused to show up until checks cleared. At 3, the Department of Labor received formal complaints from groups of employees who thought the company was intentionally withholding pay. Regulators don't ignore those. By the end of the day, 2 separate state offices had already opened preliminary inquiries. And all of this was triggered by the removal of one person: me. Graham, the CFO, tried to bypass the system by manually approving transfers through the bank. The bank flagged them as unauthorized because the signature tokens didn't match. He tried again, this time ordering IT to override. It shook their heads. The system rejected every attempt because it wasn't broken. It was following protocol. No Teresa Cole, no authorization. By evening, the company's Slack channels had splintered into chaos. #payroll help, #where's my check, and my personal favorite, #burn it down. Employees were screenshotting their empty accounts, posting error codes, tagging managers who had no answers. One anonymous user wrote, "I think we fired the wrong person." The comment got 50 reactions before moderators deleted it. But deletions don't erase panic. The truth was circulating faster than leadership could contain it. Ethan could call it a hiccup all he wanted. To everyone else, it was a betrayal. Money that doesn't arrive on time isn't a glitch. It's survival denied. And once that trust evaporated, there was no reassuring people back into line. The company wasn't just facing angry employees anymore. It was staring down vendors, insurers, banks, and regulators, all triggered in less than a single workday. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were accelerating. By the second morning, denial had hardened into strategy. Ethan stood at the front of the executive conference room, tie loosened, insisting the payroll failure was nothing more than a legacy system hiccup. Graham backed him up, though the sweat on his collar told another story. They blamed interns for faulty inputs, blamed vendors for delays, even hinted employees were exaggerating. But the servers kept rejecting every attempt with the same cold line: authorization failed. Jenna from Accounts Payable whispered that she had retried batches 6 times, each bouncing back unchanged. When engineers finally spoke, their verdict was blunt: nothing was broken. The system was protecting itself exactly as designed. Ethan snapped, demanding they rip out the locks, while Graham warned any manual override would trigger a bank audit they couldn't survive. The silence that followed said everything. They knew oversight was coming, but they clung to the illusion of control. Instead of admitting the truth, they drafted memos promising fixes by end of day, empty words that fooled no one. Employees whispered in hallways, vendors grew restless, and regulators began circling. Their denial wasn't buying them time, it was sealing their fate. By the 3rd day, my silence became louder than any speech. Calls poured in from blocked numbers, unknown lines, and finally the one I recognized: Ethan's private cell. His voicemail was carefully measured, offering me a consulting contract and telling me to name my price. A few hours later, Graham tried, his voice tight with exhaustion, promising reinstatement and authority if I would just come back. By evening, the board chair herself left a message, dangling a public apology as if that could rewrite 10 years of dismissal. I listened to none of them in full. I deleted each before it could finish. What they didn't understand was that there was nothing to bargain over. The machine wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as I built it, rejecting unauthorized attempts and halting payroll until the rightful signer returned. And I wasn't returning. By then, employees had escalated to the Department of Labor. Regulators were circling, and the company's accounts were already in question. My absence wasn't revenge. It was design proving itself. They wanted me back only because their empire had cracked open, not because they had discovered respect. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't crave their praise, their money, or their titles. I wanted peace. Letting their pleas hang unanswered gave me exactly that. By the fourth day, it was no longer an internal problem. It was a public one. Regulators don't shout or panic. They arrive with files and authority. The Department of Labor investigators walked straight through the front doors like they owned the building, because in that moment, they did. Ethan tried to greet them with charm, but charm doesn't override subpoenas. Graham followed close behind carrying binders, hoping paperwork might soften the blow. None of it mattered. The investigators asked for logs, not excuses, and the logs told the story plainly. Payroll cycles aborted, signer credential missing, authorization tied to one identity, mine. They saw the truth in minutes, something leadership had denied for days. Employees had already filed dozens of complaints, forcing state agencies to act. By mid-afternoon, the company's payroll accounts were frozen under federal order. No checks, no reimbursements, no vendor payments could move until compliance was restored. Vendors began filing breach notices. Insurance carriers withheld coverage. The spiral was unstoppable now. I watched from home, my phone buzzing with news alerts and half-baked statements from executives pretending this was technical. Regulators weren't fooled. They knew arrogance when they saw it, and they treated it the way they always do, with oversight. Ethan's speeches, Graham's binders, Marta's HR memos, none of it mattered once the investigators locked their systems. From that moment, the company wasn't running operations. It was answering to the government. And all I had done was leave. Day 5 began with another all-hands meeting, but this one didn't have the usual pep talk or bravado. Ethan walked into the boardroom late, pale and sweating through his shirt. Graham sat beside him with stacks of binders he hoped would look like preparation, though they were nothing more than printouts of error logs that all said the same thing: authorization failed. Around the table, directors avoided eye contact. They had already spoken with regulators. They already knew what was coming. At 9:15, the Department of Labor's lead investigator entered the room with 2 auditors in tow. No introductions, no pleasantries, just business. "We have reviewed the payroll architecture," she said flatly. "Your systems are non-compliant. Authorization strings remain tied to a single credential, and that credential is inactive." Graham tried to interject, claiming IT was working on a patch, but the investigator silenced him with a glance. "You cannot patch compliance. You must operate under oversight until full remediation is complete." Oversight meant every transaction, every payroll cycle, every vendor payment would require external monitoring. Millions in new expenses just to prove they weren't breaking the law. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet, which was unusual for him. The weight of regulators staring him down finally broke the act. Outside the boardroom, word spread fast. Departments were told reimbursements would be delayed indefinitely. Vendors were told to expect quarterly reviews before any payment cleared. Employees began searching for new jobs in droves. No one trusted leadership to fix anything, and they were right not to. The collapse wasn't temporary. It was structural. I watched the aftermath from home, logged into my private archive. Every failed attempt to rerun payroll still triggered alerts on my mirror system. I didn't need insider gossip to know what was happening. The system was screaming it at me. Authorization requests piled up, stamped with Graham's initials, all rejected. Each rejection became another page in the regulator's file, each page another nail in the coffin. By the afternoon, external auditors convened with the board. Their conclusion was brutal. The company would remain under permanent financial monitoring until it rebuilt its entire payroll infrastructure from scratch, a process estimated to take up to 18 months and cost low seven figures. Until then, regulators would control the tap. They hadn't shut the company down, but they had something worse: a chokehold. Every dollar that left the building would now crawl through an approval process slower than molasses, suffocating operations and burning cash. Ethan's empire wasn't dead. It was paralyzed. Graham slumped in his chair. The fight drained out of him. Ethan tried to salvage dignity by asking, "What if the former employee returns?" The investigator didn't even look up from her notes. "She's not under your authority anymore. And we don't reinstate oversight based on wishful thinking." That was the real dagger. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't stolen a cent. I had simply walked away. And the design they dismissed as invisible had done exactly what it was built to do: prevent unauthorized access. They fired me, and in doing so, they fired their only safeguard. As evening fell, the boardroom emptied, but no one spoke. Outside, reporters gathered on the sidewalk, sniffing for a scandal. Inside, leadership faced a truth they could no longer bury. They had mocked the invisible architect, and now the walls of their house were closing in, reinforced by regulators who would never leave. Their collapse wasn't a fireball or an explosion. It was a suffocation, slow and certain, with oversight as the permanent noose tightening around their necks. They thought firing me would erase me, but what they erased was the very heartbeat of their company. In 5 days, the empire they built on arrogance suffocated under its own weight, not because I struck back, but because I stepped aside and let the truth reveal itself. The lesson is simple. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never confuse invisibility with irrelevance. For 10 years, I was just IT, overlooked, dismissed, even mocked. Yet the system that carried their payroll, their compliance, their credibility, lived and breathed through the code I wrote. When they removed me, they didn't just fire an employee. They cut the thread holding their entire house together. In life, the same principle applies. We all hold hidden value: skills, integrity, experience that often goes unseen until it's gone. Being underestimated can sting, but it can also be your quiet power. You don't need to shout your worth for it to exist. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't action at all. It's absence. And when systems, relationships, or companies built on disrespect crumble without you, it's not sabotage. It's truth coming to light. The real takeaway isn't about destruction. It's about preparation, about documenting your value and refusing to let others define it for you. Arrogant leaders may believe they can cut corners and cut people. But when the storm comes, the ones they called replaceable turn out to be the foundation. And foundations, once removed, cannot be faked. How to get started today. 1. Write down the systems or tasks only you know how to do. Recognize your hidden value. 2. Create backups of your skills, certifications, portfolios, or even a personal archive. 3. Set boundaries at work. Don't trade dignity for empty praise. If you've ever felt invisible at work, I want to hear your story. Comment below, share this with someone who's been underestimated, and don't forget to subscribe, because your voice matters more than they think.